Okay, let's go ahead and take you guys through the process of preparing this model to make an animated turntable. Then we're going to light the model, and then we're actually going to render out the animated sequence or the image sequence of frames. And finally, we will put it all back together as a video sequence using Adobe Photoshop. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to address aspect ratios and composition. Okay, I'm going to do this by clicking on this icon right here, and what this will do is this will turn on my film gate. Now the film gate helps you to visualize the areas of your workspace that are actually going to render, and it is actually based off of your perspective camera right here. Now in the case of this particular object that I'm going to be rendering, I'm going to set that horizontal film aperture for the perspective camera in the channel box editor to a horizontal film aperture of 1 and a vertical film aperture of 1. All right. Now the reason why I'm going with this 1-to-1 ratio, which produces a square format, is because of how it manages to complement what it is that I'm going to be animating in this turntable sequence. All right. Now another thing that I feel you're going to want to do is you might have an object that's modeled out of a whole bunch of different pieces and parts. If that's the case, make sure that you select everything that is going to be rendered. You click on Mesh and you come down and you combine them so that Maya will recognize and honor them as one object as opposed to multiple objects that are kind of smashed together. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to do is come in here and I will adjust my timeline. All right, I want to take in my timeline, I want these two values right here to both be 1. And on this opposite end of my timeline, I'm going to change that default value of 120 to 240. Okay, because we're going to render out 240 individual frames, which in theory will produce 10 seconds of animation at 24 frames per second. All right, so now on your timeline, you can click it on individual frames, or you can click and hold and drag. I want to make sure that that little mark is set to frame 1. I'm going to come over here to the channel box editor and right click on rotate Y and select key selected. Now what that'll do is that will record that value of Y at that particular position on the timeline. Now let's come over to frame 40 and make sure that you have this little toggle switch turned red. All right, this is our auto key toggle, meaning that when that is selected on a new position on the timeline, I can come in here and I can simply change this value. I'll change it to -360, and what that will do is that will automatically record that new value. So now that I play this on my timeline, you can see that it rotates that full -360 degrees, which produces a clockwise rotation. Now, one of the reasons why this is the next step from adjusting your film gate is because I want to make sure that my camera is positioned in such a way that I'm going to get the best bang for my buck as this object is rotating in my screen composition. All right, I'm watching for areas where maybe I get a little too close to the edge of my composition, or heaven forbid if it ends up being cropped. We don't want any cropping. Okay, sometimes it means zooming out and giving yourself just a little bit more negative space there. Okay, and I'm generally satisfied with how that looks. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a camera bookmark. This is done by clicking on View in the Viewport submenu, coming down to Bookmarks and selecting Edit Bookmark. I'm going to create new bookmark, and I'm going to go ahead and give this the name Render View and hit Close. And now as we continue to work on this scene, we have to rotate it and look at it at different angles. I can always go back to that same view by clicking on View, coming down to Bookmarks and selecting a Render View bookmark. Okay. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to start to introduce some lights to this Maya scene. This is done by clicking on Arnold, coming down to Lights, and adding in an area light. Now this area light, you can see that it's appeared in my outliner. I'm going to go ahead and select that. I'm going to press W on my keyboard to get the translate tool and bring it out here to the side. All right, and so with this light, let me just turn off my grid so this is easier to see. Basically, we have what, it kind of looks like that box that you use to import an image plane. And it has a handle pointing perpendicularly off of that box. Now, this box right here is the light source. It is the light emitter. And this handle shows us the direction that this will be emitting light in. So one thing that I can do to help me kind of strategically position this light source is to have it selected, click on panels in the viewport submenu, and come down to look through selected. And then you can go ahead and navigate this around as if it were a camera. All right, so I'm going to pull it back and I'm going to position it about right in here like so. Now I can also tap 7 on my keyboard and that will turn off the default lights in favor of this actual light source that we've created. Now everything's turned black and we'll address that in just a second. I'm going to click on panels, come down to perspective, and go back to my perspective camera. All right, I'm going to come in here and let's see, bookmark, go back to my render view. Now the reason why everything's black is because with this area light, it doesn't have a sufficient amount of intensity for the light to actually fully reach our model. Okay, because the way that these area lights work is there's a certain degree of decay. The closer you are to the light source, the more likely that light is to hit the object. The farther away you are, the more likely no light is actually going to be hitting that particular point on the model. So right here, if I select the area light and in the channel box editor I come down, I'll see that the intensity is currently set to 1. All right, let's dial this up a little bit. I'm actually going to just jump straight up to 500. Okay, and now you can see that some light is hitting the top part of our model. And, and it gets progressively darker as it gets down to the bottom because of that decay rate that we talked about. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to start doing some rendering. But before I do that, I'm going to go to my render settings, and I'm going to make sure that my render settings aspect ratios match the film gate aspect ratio that I've set up here in the Maya viewport. This is done by going to the Common tab, coming down to Image Size. And in my particular case, I want to render this out at 1K square because that aspect ratio best works with my particular model. All right, now if you are working with an object that is more horizontally aligned than vertically aligned or kind of squarely situated, you can select one of these other aspect ratios. I would recommend maybe an HD 1080, which will give you a 16:9 aspect ratio. All right, but once again, I'm going to go with the 1K square. I'll go ahead and close this, and I'm going to click on this icon right here to start a render. All right, and sometimes this takes just a second, and the render has started in a separate monitor, so I'll go ahead and drag it over here. All right, so now that this is rendered, I'm going to click on this icon right here, and what that'll do is that will actually temporarily save that render. It's kind of nice doing that because you can toggle back and forth between different render states just to assess how little tweaks and finesses affect the overall model. Now, generally speaking, I like this. I wasn't expecting to come up with a light positioning that I liked, right out of the box. But, chances are your first rendering pass isn't going to be that great. So what you're going to want to do, I'll just minimize that render window, is you're going to want to continue to play around with your intensity. You might want to play around with the scale of your light source and how close or far away your light source is from the object that you are going to be rendering. These different values are going to produce different effects as far as the rendering is concerned. And just tweaking them and finding the right balance of those variables as per how your model is set up will help you to optimize the lighting placement for whatever it is that you're trying to showcase. Okay, now one other thing that I did want to get into is with my light selected, and actually I'm going to double click on my light here in the outliner, and I'm going to call this key light because this is my primary light source. I'm going to go to the attribute editor. Something I want to do is play around a little bit with the sampling. All right, by default, right here in the first section, the Arnold Area Light attributes of the attribute editor, you're going to see this samples it's set to 1. I'm going to increase that to 3. Then you have volume samples that are set to 2, and I'm going to increase that to 4. And now I'm going to do another render. All right, what the sampling does is the sampling calculates how many interactions the camera is going to have with the light source, which is going to have with the object that's being rendered. And the more interactions that you have, generally the better your model is going to be. I'm going to pause this real fast because it looks like Maya just quit on me, and we will resume in just a second. Okay, I apologize about that. Hopefully things are back on target. Let's go ahead and just resume right where we left off. So the last thing that I did is I increased the sampling. All right, so these samples right here from 3, and then the volume samples to 4. Now what I want you to do is take a look at the difference between the two. All right, so in this particular case, if I zoom in, you can see just how grainy the shadows are, particularly where the shadow edges start to diffuse. With those increased samples, what that does is, there still might be a little graininess, but particularly where there's some diffusion of the shadows, it makes that work considerably better. All right. So here we go. We have our primary light source set up. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an ambient light source. So I'll go ahead and minimize the render view and click on Arnold, and I'm going to come down to lights, and I'm going to use a sky dome. All right, now with the sky dome, if I were to go back in and do another render, it's going to be kind of funny. It's basically what we've done is we've created a sphere around this object. All the faces of the sphere that are pointing inward are emitting light themselves. Now in this particular case, it's white, it's 100% intensity, and it ends up creating this effect where, to a certain degree it looks all right, but also to another degree it kind of blows the model out. Now, what I'd like to do personally, and this is a matter of personal preference, is I'd like to kind of offset this model against a dark background. I feel like I can get a little bit more subtlety out of the model in doing so. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, minimize it, and with the sky dome light selected in the outliner, I'm going to come over here. Now what you can do is you can click on this swatch, you can change the color, you can change the value, etc., or you can create an input node and replace the color with something else. So I'm going to click on this little checker box right here, and it's going to pull up a bunch of different options. There's default textures. You can actually put a file in there, so you could have a photographic environment around the object, etc. But for the purposes of this demo, we're going to go with a ramp. Okay. Now what the ramp is going to do is it's going to put a gradient behind the object. Now I want to swap these little handles on the dark side and on the light side. Alright, so it's darker at the top and lighter on the bottom. Maybe I'll leave the dark about right there. I'm actually going to click on this white handle and come down to the selected color swatch. I select that. I want to select a considerably darker gray. Alright, so it goes from black to a dark gray. I'm going to play around with the placement of that a little bit. And the reason why I like this is having a darker gradient at the top and a lighter gradient at the bottom is the darker values help to offset the portions of the model that are in light, and then the lighter values help to offset the portions of the model that are in shadow. All right, I'm just going to save this here just to play it safe. Let's go ahead and do another render and see what we get. Okay, here are the results of that render. So you can see it gradiates from a darker value to a lighter value right down here, although it's still a little on the light side for my tastes. Now we can fix that. I'm going to just save that render. We can fix that by selecting the sky dome light, going back into the attribute editor. I'm actually going to reduce the intensity down. I'm going to try reducing it down to a 0.5, so that's going to be half as bright in the background by theory. And let's do another render. Once this gets going, hopefully it'll just take about 15 seconds or so. All right, so we're going to double check the effects of that intensity in just a second. I might still want to go back in and adjust the values on that ramp shader. So let's save that. There. So here's where we came from. There's where we went with the lesser degree of intensity. All right. You also notice the values in the cast shadows and in the core shadows. You know, they get darker with the background because there's less ambient light getting in there and lightening them up or diffusing them. I'm going to come back to the color section, and you see that it has this little kind of arrow to a box icon that's replaced a checkerboard. If I click that, that's going to take me back to this particular ramp tool. So I'm going to make that darker right there. I'm going to do another render. Give it just a second to get started. And really what I'm trying to do with these tweaks is I'm trying to just put the object in a position where it gets some nice contrast. And I like the direction that this is going. Now it is feeling a little dark, all right? So I'm going to just save that. Here's where we were. Here's where we started from. I like it getting a little dark in the background, but it maybe is getting a little too dark, you know, for this section of the trawler right in here. So we're actually going to fix that by supplementing a rim light to kind of light up some of these areas and help preserve that rear contour. So I'm going to minimize that. Let's see, I'm going to rename this back to key light. It defaulted back to the area light because of that crash that I had. I'm going to select that and hit Command D to duplicate it. And now let's take this duplicate. Let's name it Rim Light. Just once again, for good measure, I'm going to save. I'll click on Panels, come down to Look Through Selected. All right. And I'm going to try positioning it somewhere in here. Okay. Panels, Perspective, go back to my perspective camera. And for this particular light, for the rim light, I can actually adjust the intensity right here through the attribute editor as well. So it has the same intensity of 500 that the previous one had. I'm going to try 1500. I want it to have a really nice strong accent on that backside. And let's see what happens. Now, there's a good chance that the render is going to take longer because now we've added one more light source in there that has a higher sampling rate, so there's more calculations to be performed. So I'm guessing it's going to go up from that 15 to 16 seconds or so, possibly double that. We'll see here in just a second. Okay, I'll just added a couple of extra seconds to that. Now I'm going to save that and kind of see, you know, where we came from, where we went. I don't really like how it's working, so I am going to need to play around with this light just a little bit. I'm going to zoom my camera out, and let's try scaling this up. All right, I'm going to try and scale it up to 10. All right, because if you remember, we talked about scale and proximity and intensity, all helping to contribute in slightly different ways to the model. I'm going to look through this again and maybe position the camera, or not the camera, but the light source rather, somewhere back in here. You know, and maybe we actually position it in a way where we're kind of looking up at the boat and we start to get a little spill light on this backside. Okay, let's go ahead and go back to the perspective camera, go back to my bookmark, and do another render. Okay, I think I could play around with it just a little bit more. Alright, I think I'm going to tone down this intensity. Let's try going back to 500, what the original intensity was. And now this time what I want to do is I want to pay attention to what's going on right here in this area. So I can drag a selection over it and click on this icon and do a localized render of just what's happening in that area. Once I make sure that it's working out here the way that I want it to, then what we'll do is we'll turn around and we'll do another final render with everything else. Okay. Pull this light source back. In a way, I'm kind of glad that it's given me some fits, because this helps to better illustrate, just the little tweaks that you need to make here and there to really help draw out and sell the form the way that you want, or the way that it needs. Now that I've repositioned it and stuff, I feel like I need to dial that intensity back up. Let's go back to 1500, drag another selection over this area, do another render. Okay. I'll see how this one goes. Then I think what I'm going to do is pause the video while I play around with that just a little bit, just to try and get the right balance between the key light, the sky dome, and the rim light. Okay, I think I finally found a spot where I'm satisfied with the overall outcome. You can see as I scrub through this, I played around with a whole bunch of different options with intensity, placement, etc., relative to the object or to the model itself. I ended up setting a scale of that rim light to 4. I actually decided to really dial down the intensity. It just was drawing a little too much attention to the prow of the boat, which I didn't necessarily want. I'm feeling generally good with this right here. I think I am going to go back to the sky dome real fast. I am going to go back to my ramp, and let me back up real fast. I'm going to go just back to the sky dome. I'm going to give this a little bit more intensity here in the background. I'll start with 1 and see what that looks like, just to try and offset some of the stuff here in the background, or particularly on the bottom of the model. I think that's what I'm going to go with. This will give me stronger contrast between my areas that are in solid shadow and what's going on with the background. Pop this boat forward just a teeny bit more. So I'm going to do one more render to make sure that I am happy and completely satisfied with how everything's turning out. All right, I think that looks really nice. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we are going to render out the full sequence of 240 frames. Now, before you do so, make sure that your project is set. Come down to Set Projects. Make sure that you have the right root folder selected. It's the folder that'll have your images folder, your source images folder, your scenes folder, and all the additional folders associated with this particular project. The reason for this is because when we initiate this rendering out this entire sequence, it's going to dump all those frames directly into your images folder. This way it goes exactly where you expect those files to end up going or being saved to, and you don't have to go digging through your computer to try and figure out where they're actually at. So go ahead and click on your render settings right here. And we're going to get started with this file output. I'm going to give this a name. All of the frames will end up starting with this file prefix name. I'm going to change my image format to JPEG, make sure the quality is set to 100. I'm going to change the animation frame extension to name.number.extension. Now, if you look up here at the top, right here in this area, you'll see that it has a prefix. It has the number of the frame, and then it has JPEG. I'm going to set the padding to 3, so that way it will have 001 when it gets into double digits. It might be 057 when it gets into the triple digits. It might be 182.jpg. This helps keep the frames in order for when we bring them back together and assemble them into a single video. Right, the next thing you want to do is you want to come down to the start frame, make sure it's at 1. You want to set the end frame to 240. Make sure we're rendering from your perspective camera. The preset should already be taken care of, etc. Go ahead and hit close. Leave your render view open, and now we need to hop over to the rendering section of the program. So click on your drop down, go from modeling into rendering, select render, and come down to render sequence. Now what's going to happen is it's going to use the render view to render out every single one of those individual frames, and as I stated earlier, it's going to dump those frames into the images folder. So I'm going to pause the video real fast until we get a couple of frames under our belt, then we'll resume the video and talk about it a little bit more. Okay, so the rendering process is still going on, but let's hop over to the Finder window and actually take a look at our images folder. So you can see, if I just select this file and tap the spacebar, it'll pull up a preview, and I can come down through these. You can see, that slow, deliberate rotation that we're getting as we're rendering out each one of these individual frames. Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and let this continue to render, and I'll create a follow-up tutorial for this particular tutorial that shows you how to take these rendered frames and assemble them back together into a single video file.